Linguistics Behind the Scenes.
What you always wanted to know about language and how to explore it.
With Christina Sanchez-Stockhammer.
And Dominic Piazza.
Hello everyone, welcome back. Hi Dominic.
Yeah, welcome back indeed. Hi Christina, how are you doing?
I'm fine, what about you?
Well, I'm always doing well when we're making a podcast.
Ooh.
Christina, I'm curious, as a linguist, you have a lot of experience with different languages, both professionally but also personally, because you find them interesting. When was the last time you took a language class?
That's a really good question. It was a while ago. It was actually when I learned Chinese because I wanted to travel to China. And I think it's a very interesting language. And so I took a language class. But when I started commuting to another city in order to teach there, I had to stop doing that. But then with the help of a book, I still managed to, get along in areas of China where no one spoke English or German, you know. But I don't think I have taken an actual language class ever since. And that was a few years ago, I have to admit.
Wow. Yeah. Chinese, challenging for many reasons. I think the writing is probably the biggest challenge because it uses the logographic Chinese characters, which Japanese also borrows. Fun fact, Korean used to use Chinese characters, but about 500 years ago, I believe the Korean emperor, he decided that the rate of literacy in Korea was just far too low and that the Chinese characters were a major obstacle to that. And so they did away with the Chinese characters and they invented their own syllabic alphabet. The Korean alphabet is purely syllabic. So of those three, I would think Korean, well, at least in terms of the writing, Korean is absolutely the easiest to learn.
Yeah, I mean, I think alphabetic writing is a lot easier. But I mean, in addition, I mean, if you think about the tone, I mean, the tones of Chinese, I also find that difficult. But it was fun. It was fun to learn. And I have to say, I really enjoyed looking at those characters and trying to recognize them, trying to learn them, associating them with the different shops, for example, where you found them. And when I returned to China a few years ago, I mean, I barely remembered anything, but then a few things came back. So it must have been successful learning after all. And I enjoyed it. It was at the Volkshochschule. You know what the Volkshochschule is?
So this is, I had to learn about this when I was in Germany. This is a type of community learning, community college type institution. It's not a university, but it's for adults who want to learn things.
Yeah, you can learn all kinds of things there. I mean, different languages, but you could also take classes in pottery or dancing or all kinds of things that you want to learn. So they usually have a very large program and it's not terribly expensive and it's very nice. It's very often in the city center and it's a place that a lot of people go to in order to learn more. So a place where adults can improve their knowledge in specialized fields they're interested in. And so I had really, really good teachers there. It was a lot of fun. It was very, very helpful. And I would have loved to continue. But then, I had to go off and teach myself.
Yeah, that is cool. That to me, that's very reminiscent of something we have in the United States, which is a community college, which offers very similar services, but also you can complete, usually a university degree takes about 4 years here. In Germany, for many of the subjects, it's only 3 years. I'm a little bit jealous. So at the community college, you can complete the first 2 years of your university degree. And then from there, you move on, you transfer to a university to complete the other 2 years. That is cool.
Yeah, but at the Volkshochschule, I mean, usually you don't get any degrees, any certificates. I mean, you might get them for some things. For example, if you're learning how to use certain types of software, it might be something that you want to show a future employer. But quite a lot of the other things are really just entertainment, things that you do just for yourself.
Yeah, for personal enrichment. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And cool that you were able to pick up some Chinese. Again, with these Chinese characters, they're really special because the Chinese characters, they have a meaning which is they have a meaning on their own separate from how they may be pronounced, which is, I think, hard for Westerners to imagine. For example, I learned the meaning of a lot of the Chinese characters in English. So I could look at a Chinese character and I could tell you that means water. And then you could say, that's great. How do you say it in Chinese? And I'll say, I don't know. I didn't learn that. So, which is, that's, you can't really have that in any other system, but it definitely adds a degree of complexity.
Yeah, but at the same time, of course, if you have a very large country in which the way or the languages that are spoken are so different that you wouldn't really understand each other properly, of course, it's very helpful to have those characters in writing, which allow you to have some kind of conversation through the written language. So it's independent from how it is spoken, how it's pronounced, and you just know the meaning through how it's written. And of course, that's quite special about those characters, and that's what attracted me in the first place. So I first learned about Chinese when I was a student at the University of Reading, when I was doing my year abroad in Great Britain, and we had a class that was very cool because we were supposed to learn something about the Chinese language just by asking a person who was a native speaker of Chinese all the questions that we had. And so we had to find out about the grammar ourselves. And that really sparked my interest. I thought that was a very, very interesting type of class.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, and San Francisco very famously has a huge Chinese community, the largest Chinatown in the United States, I believe. And so when you walk around certain parts of San Francisco, you'll see some Chinese lettering, and the characters are really beautiful and so intriguing. Like, I want to know what they mean, right? Because there are so many of them.
Yeah, so now we've spoken a lot about my last language class in the Chinese language, but what about you, Dominic? What's the last language class that you took?
Yeah, definitely German when I was in Germany, and I've spoken about that quite a bit over the course of this podcast. I went to Germany with very limited German. I did do some Duolingo. I did learn some basics, but when you travel there and you're on your own in a new environment, surrounded by a foreign language, you need a lot more than just please and thank you and things like that. So I learned German while I was there, took a couple of courses and worked my way up. And that was my last time studying a language. And of course, I think, as is common in language classes, you are usually taught the formal language first.
Yeah, the formal language, or some kind of a standard variety, a kind of standard level that is supposed not to be extremely formal, but not informal either. So it's a bit artificial in that sense, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, in some respects, it's safer if it's a bit formal. If you're too formal, then you might seem a bit too distanced, possibly overly polite. But if you're too informal, then you might actually get into trouble more easily. So I suppose it's actually the safer option for teaching.
I totally agree with you. Yeah, I totally agree with you. It's better to learn the polite language first, because if you're overly polite, you're probably not going to offend someone. But if you're not polite enough, you could. Also, as they say, you need to learn the rules before you can break them. So that's why it makes sense to learn kind of polite, formal language. But for some learners, it can be a little bit frustrating because, they want to go out and have conversations, and learning formal language may not be the most useful for that, at least immediately. And so, yeah, if you use formal language in an informal situation, you might seem a little bit stiff or stilted. I ran into that in Germany when I was there.
Oh yeah, I guess you did. I mean, usually you notice if people have actually had the opportunity to have conversations with actual native speakers of a language, because you notice immediately if they're using the right kind of pronunciation, rhythm, vocabulary that is typical of a certain communicative situation, like at a party, for example.
Yes, exactly. In German, there are two ways of addressing a person, two ways of referring to you, the second person. This is really common across most European languages, or at least many European languages, I should say. And
Yeah.
I would think it certainly must exist in some other languages around the world. So in German, there is du, which is the informal you, something you would use with a friend or a peer or someone you know. And then there is sie, which is the formal you, something you would use in a professional context, maybe with someone older than you, with a superior at work, so on and so forth. And yeah, we learn sie first because it's probably more useful, if you're in Germany and you're going about your life interacting with people at work or interacting with strangers in public. Usually you're supposed to, I think, speak formally with strangers, but depends on the strangers, right? That's what I learned.
Yeah. But in addition, I mean, there's a very good reason why you may also want to teach the Sie form, the polite form first. And that is because the form that you use for the verb is identical with the infinitive. So
it is
for
easier,
example, so to make is machen. And then, I mean, for the du form, it would be du machst. But for the Sie form, it's Sie machen, just like the infinitive machen. So, I mean, that way you just have to learn one verb form in the beginning and you can immediately start talking.
You're absolutely right. As a learner, if I could have it my way, we would just all be speaking formally to each other all the time because it's so much easier to conjugate the verb because the verb doesn't really get conjugated. It stays in its infinitive form, essentially. So much easier for me. But yeah, my first week or maybe my second week in Germany, I went to a party in my neighborhood. And as I was, and my German was extremely, extremely limited. Like I had only had like a week or two of lessons. And so I asked some of the young Germans, I asked, wie heißen Sie? Which just means what's your name? Literally it means what do you call yourself? But yeah, what's your name? But it's formal. The informal would be wie heißt du? Same thing. What's your name? And so I said, wie heißen Sie to a young man. And he gave me this look. He looked almost offended. and he corrected me. He said, du, wie heißt du? Kind of saying that he wanted me to talk to him informally, but almost kind of saying that I had made a mistake, that I should have spoken to him informally because we're at a party and we were probably pretty similar in age. And that's when I learned that even though these were strangers, even though I was meeting them for the first time, that doesn't mean I have to use formal language because of the context.
Yeah, exactly. Because of the context, because of the group of speakers you're talking to. I mean, it's pretty complicated in some ways to use du and sie. I mean, as an adult, so typically sie is the form you would use. But when you're a student and when you're talking to other students, I mean, you're all adults, but you would still use the du form, the informal form. So that's a kind of tradition in Germany, at least in the present time, So among peers, that would be usual. But then, of course, if you're in a company, there might also be peers, your colleagues, but there it's not so easy. So you would first need to see if they also want to use the informal form with you or not. And I mean, if you meet family, it's yet another thing. So if you meet family, so family is also du, but it could be that you've never met them before. And this is something that happened to me some time ago, that we met some distant relatives that we hadn't met before. And I think the very first thing we said was sie. We explained that
with your own family.
Yeah, no, wait a moment. I mean, like you knock on their door, you say, oh, hello, by the way, could we introduce ourselves? We found out that it looks like we're relatives. And then the next thing is you switch over to du, to the informal form.
You weren't sure.
Exactly. Because still it's adults talking to other adults in a situation where you don't know each other. You first have to feel your way into this. But the moment you know your family, bam, you switch over to the du form, the informal form, because it's family, so that overrides a lot of other things.
And there's a lovely word in German for when you switch over to this informal form, right? Duzen, right? To switch to the informal you. Now, there is a word for the inverse. There is sitzen, when you would switch to the formal you, but gosh, I would hope that never happens. When would that happen? I feel like that would be a bad thing if that happened, going from being familiar to less familiar. Oh.
Yeah, but it's built on the premise that it's really switching to that form. But duzen and siezen just means using the form du, using the form sie. And so it's not really the switching, it's just the use of the form. So in that sense, it's not as bad. So siezen is just the thing that you do as a default with strangers.
Right. Okay. Cool. Very cool. And once upon a time, English did distinguish between the formal you and the informal you. We were left with only one. And quite interestingly, the one we were left with is the formal one, I believe.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there used to be the form thou. Thou hast done this.
As you would see in Shakespeare.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so that was the informal form. It was the more intimate form. Also used among peers, etc. But in the end, this got lost. Yeah, so it's a long story, but it seems that nobility used the you form, and in the end, other people imitated the nobility, and in the end, the you form is the one that stuck. And now the thou form is used in prayers, for example, but otherwise, or in Shakespeare plays or in fantasy films where you're trying to kind of pretend it's the olden times, but otherwise, well, you don't really use thou anymore. And it's very funny because in Germany, I mean, sometimes people say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we got away with this du versus sie? This is also complicated. It's so hierarchical. Couldn't we all say you to each other? It's a lot friendlier. But of course, if you think about it, actually everyone is using the more distanced form in English, but it doesn't matter because if you just have one, well, it's the only one, and so it's also the friendly form, the intimate one.
Yeah, as evidenced by the fact that we say you are, and are is usually for plural words. That's because the you, it can be formal or it could be when you're speaking to more than one person. Maybe what some people in America would say, y'all, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's the same in German, by the way. I mean, the sie form, if you think about sie is also a plural. Yeah,
it is. Yeah,
sie machen das. Yeah.
Yeah. Other languages, as I mentioned, have this too. French has tu and vous, so informal and formal. Vous, you could almost think of as the analog to the English you. It even kind of looks similar and sounds similar. And they also have, similar to duzen and sitzen, they have tutoyer and vous voyez. I think describes the same exact concepts, which is very sweet. Spanish also has these levels of formality as it relates to the second person pronoun you, but it's a little bit more complicated because it depends on where in the world you are, because there's kind of a collection of second person pronouns in Spanish. And then other European languages like Italian also has tu and lei. So this is something as a learner that you have to pay attention to.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, as you just told us, at that party, I mean, it's funny. So when you use language that is too formal, that is not appropriate, then somehow it's still not ideal. And I mean, if you think about language, I mean, very often people will believe that you should always use perfect, correct, formal language in all contexts. But one of the examples that I like to use in my linguistics classes is that if you are dressed in a tuxedo, or if you're dressed in like with swimming trunks, I mean, probably most people would say, oh, the tuxedo is preferable. But if you're at the beach, I would say the swimming trunks are definitely better, And so it's the same thing. So, I mean, language has to be used in different ways, in different contexts. And those contexts include the communicative situation. So it depends on who is there with you, what the relation between you is. So is it one person or several people? Do you know each other? Is there a hierarchy of some kind? Are you in the same place? Are you in different places? Are you communicating directly or is it spoken? Is it written? So quite a lot of factors enter this. And so that's the beautiful concept of register. So register meaning that you have a variety of language use that depends on the communicative situation.
Yeah, exactly. Just like you said, language is very situational, naturally. And yeah, this term register, I learned this term recently. This is, I believe, the linguistic term for level of formality, essentially. And I think, for example, you can tell if someone uses a word or a phrase which doesn't match the register of the situation. So, for example, I speak to a lot of people who learn English as their second language because I think most of the world has learned English as their second language. And sometimes someone might use a word or a phrase which is too formal for the situation, but they don't know. They don't know. And it's probably because they learned it in school, maybe, right? And so you can always, I think we're kind of carefully attuned to register, even if we're not doing it on purpose.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, if you know a language well, you will be able to decide what kind of language is appropriate in a particular communicative situation. And I mean, register, if you follow the register theories set up by Douglas Biber and some colleagues, well, then the register in this sense can be communicative situations like a phone conversation or a newspaper editorial, or it can be a novel. So it really depends. I mean, it's very, very different in type, but there's certain things that you would expect to read in, let's say, an article on sports, and you would expect different types of vocabulary if you were watching a romantic comedy on Netflix,
Oh yeah. Or depending on the section of the newspaper. If you're reading a general news article, it's going to be very formal, very neutral, no first person pronouns, at least on the part of the author. There might be quotes from people. But then if you go to the opinion section of the newspaper, it's totally different. There, well, it can be a lot more like an essay with plenty of first-person pronouns, because the writers there are openly expressing their own opinions, and they don't have to use ultra-neutral language. It's literally an opinion. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, I mean, these different registers, they can be described by looking at the situational context. So these are things like the speakers, their relation to each other, etc. And then, of course, you can also look at the kind of words that are used in this particular register and the kinds of grammar. And then you try to see what's the relation between them, because you would expect that the language that is used in a particular context is used precisely because it's particularly well adapted. It's like in biology where animals adapt to the certain niche. So you might have a certain type of fish that, for example, feeds on a particular plant, and therefore you have a lot of that fish in a particular area. And it's a bit the same with language, with registers.
Yeah, so I think we've done a good job of illustrating why register is important and what it is and how it affects, our conversations or our writing. Is this a topic you've had any interest in researching at all?
Yeah, I mean, I've done different research in the field of register. And I mean, one model that you can apply is Biber's multi-dimensional analysis. So that basically means that you look at a lot of different features. And I mean, by features, I mean things like how many personal pronouns are there, or how many active or passive constructions are there. So, I mean, if you think about conversations, in conversations, you would expect that there's a lot of I and you and many questions and relatively short sentences, because otherwise it's hard to process. But for example, if you think about written language, well, the sentences might get longer, you might get more passives. So for example, in academic articles, you might have the passive, for example, in the methodology part, where you could say something like,
participants were observed rather than we observed the participants.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You could do that. I mean, it's not recommended in any way. I mean, it's not ideal, but still, you could do that. And it's sometimes necessary because it wouldn't be ideal to use I or we in every sentence when you explain what you did. You want to have a bit of variety there. And so what Douglas Biber did is that he, for example, produced a long list of different features that you can use in order to categorize any kind of communicative situation. And I think that's an extremely useful list in his book. But one feature was missing, and I thought, what about punctuation marks? You know, I'm really interested in punctuation marks. And so I thought, couldn't it be the case that punctuation is also different in different types of register?
Yeah. Well. So obviously, only in written material. I mean, writers can be very particular about their punctuation. They can be very particular and they can use certain punctuation in certain situations and for certain reasons. Punctuation can have different meanings in different contexts, right? So in an academic article, punctuation may be used totally differently from how it's used in a text message to your friend, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that's a very good example because those are very different types of communicative situation. And so I think if you want to kind of find out about what is specific to one particular register, then it's good to compare it to a completely different one. And so what I did is I thought, okay, if punctuation marks could help us distinguish between registers, well, on the one hand, they would need to have some kind of meaning. And on the other hand, it should be possible to find out simply by comparing two very different samples of text. And so I selected comics. And I compared those to academic research articles.
That's quite a dichotomy. That is a range right there.
Yeah. And I mean, so for the meaning of the punctuation marks, I mean, I just told you that in conversations, you have a lot of questions, right? And if you think about a question, I mean, any question will usually have a question mark in the end. So that's what you expect. And questions also have a certain grammatical structure. So sometimes the subject and the verb are inversed, or you have an auxiliary verb in the beginning. So something like, did the Prime Minister resign? So questions, they have a particular kind of meaning. They're built in a particular way, and they end with a question mark. But it's the same with statements. I mean, statements, they just have this kind of subject, verb, object structure typically, and they end with a full stop. So, so here again, I mean, the full stop just means I'm making a statement. And if you think about exclamation marks, I mean, exclamation marks also have meaning. So they can be directive. So you can say, leave me alone, exclamation mark. So here it's an imperative. So there's no subject. So the verb is in a kind of base form, but they could also just be an expression of some kind of emotion, some exclamation. If you said something like, oh, what a funny hat, exclamation mark. So I think the punctuation marks are typically associated with certain meanings. And for that reason, I would also expect them to fulfill these functions in different types of text. And so, I mean, if you think about academic texts, I mean, there's research questions in academic texts, but I don't think that they are usually expressed with a question mark in the end. It could also just be an indirect question. It could be something like, we wanted to find out whether men or women speak more words throughout the day,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Usually with a research article, you're answering a question rather than asking a question. But you do ask questions, especially at the end, right? Further inquiry. But even so, you would phrase it indirectly.
Nah, not everyone. I mean, like, I think I very often actually use questions in my own research articles.
Oh, wow.
So I even very often list them with I have a list of bullet points, and then the questions are listed underneath each other. And I say, okay, I want to find out the following things, because I think it's easier to process when you have the questions right there as a question.
Very structured. Yeah, very structured.
Yeah.
For sure.
But not everyone does that. And I think traditionally this hasn't been the case. So I think I've been taking this over from presentations that I did, just because I like the style, because I like it to be accessible. But of course, the question is, are there many question marks in academic articles or not? I mean, the conversations, we have them, but what about the academic articles? And so what I did is I compiled 2 very small corpora, collections of texts. So for the academic articles, I used 3 academic articles. So it's not huge, I know that. And but that was to match the comics corpus, because as you know, I carried out research on comics before, and I compiled a corpus of the language that you find in the speech bubbles, in the text boxes, etc. And so I took 3 comics. So I took Superman, Batman, and Uncle Scrooge, and then I compared those to those 3 research articles.
Yeah. So for a couple of things, first of all, I would think when it comes to exclamation marks are wonderful. Or exclamation points. I think there's a regional divide in terms of what you call it. They are wonderful. I would think that they are mostly reserved for the informal realm, mostly. You can use exclamation marks when writing to your friends and things, and it can add a lot of personality to your writing. But you could also use exclamation marks when you're writing dialogue for whatever purpose, whether you're writing dialogue in a novel or a play or a comic book. Again, a comic book is a work of fiction. They can be very useful for that. But in the more serious realm, the realm of academic articles or the realm of journalism or the realm of nonfiction writing, I would think you wouldn't find any exclamation marks at all.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I also found out in my study, because I mean, they're connected to emotions, and I mean, academic research is not about emotions. It's supposed to be as objective as possible. And I mean, the other thing, namely directing, telling people what to do, that's also not the function of academic research. I mean, we talked about this before. I mean, usually, at least in linguistics, what we do is, descriptive research. So we're not telling people this is how you should use language, but this is how language is actually being used. But of course, in order to find out how many question marks, punctuation marks, and so on there are, I first had to isolate them, and I used a trick for that. So
yeah, you had to take a piece of writing and you had to strip everything out of it that wasn't punctuation, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I first deleted all the letters, all the numbers, and in the end, I was just left with the punctuation marks. And then I counted them in Microsoft Word. So I used a little trick. So I just replaced them. So I said, okay, replace all the commas with commas. And then, well, that gave me the number. And then I knew how many commas there were in my text. And I did that with all the different punctuation marks I was interested in. And then in the end, entered that into a table, produced some graphs. And I think those graphs are pretty convincing.
Yeah. Well, it was also cool. I got to see what it actually looked like when you took all of the writing out and you were left with only punctuation, because like it kind of left behind like almost like a punctuation footprint, if you will. And they when you compare them to each other, they could look starkly different.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you see that a conversation and a research article, I mean, they are just stunningly different. Even if you don't have line breaks, you will notice this is a very different type of text. And of course, that speaks very much in favor of my hypothesis that it's actually yet another feature that we can consider when we want to distinguish different registers from each other.
Oh yeah, I mean, well, the academic journal articles, when I saw that, it's the dead giveaway is the parentheses. Parentheses all over the place. Parentheses, 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 right? Because they're used for parenthetical citations, and academic articles are littered with parenthetical citations. Parentheses do get used in other contexts and informal contexts for a different purpose, right? You're trying to add some additional information or what have you, but with far less frequency.
Yeah. And I mean, at least not in the comics, at least not the ones that I looked at. And
wouldn't
I
really
think,
make sense in a comic.
Yeah, because I mean, if you think about how much language there is in a speech bubble, for example, it's not very much. And so the parentheses, they require... usually they require more material to be used, just like for the semicolon. I mean, the texts are so short that you don't really expect parentheses in there. And in addition, what happens is if you had something like a little aside or additional information in a comic, you might just use an additional speech bubble, probably in a lighter color, right?
Right. There are other ways you could achieve the same thing.
Exactly. Whereas, I mean, exclamation marks, you don't find that in the academic articles.
No.
So I think these are very, very beautifully opposed if you look at the results.
Oh, right. And the semicolon. The semicolon is just very, very rare in general. I would assume in general you would mostly just find the semicolon in texts of a higher register.
Yeah, and I mean, the reason for that is that very often things are not independent from each other. I mean, what characterizes text from a higher register? They often have longer sentences, and you only have a semicolon if you have a longer sentence, because otherwise, well, you just use a full stop, you just use a comma somewhere. You are in no need to use a semicolon.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, and even in an academic text, I feel like I would mostly use it for citation purposes, right? For separating authors' names from each other. So I'm not even really using it in a sentence for the grammatical purpose. You could, though. You could. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the most common punctuation marks in an academic journal article, in a formal text, it's going to be the comma and the period, the humble all-purpose neutral period, or full stop for those across the pond. And that makes sense, right? Because as you said, well, formal writing typically has longer sentences. Longer sentences are kind of strung together. Different clauses are strung together using commas, lots and lots of commas. And of course, the period is the all-purpose way of ending a sentence or a statement. So I saw the graph that you produced kind of outlining kind of the different frequencies of the question mark, the exclamation mark, the ellipsis, ... and the kind of single quotation mark, looks like an apostrophe, and the difference is night and day.
Yeah, absolutely. But even in those cases where you see that certain punctuation marks are used in both comics and academic texts, it's so interesting to zoom in and to see what functions they fulfill there. So something that really surprised me was that I actually found quotation marks in the comics. I wouldn't have expected that because, I mean, why on earth would you need that? I mean, you need them in the academic texts in order to quote and to show something was exactly said like that. But in the comics, you have the speech bubbles. There's no need. Right. And then I saw, however, that the quotation marks are still used to quote others. For example, one we have Alfred saying, "Maybe next time, Master Bruce," and then he gets the reply, "Not maybe, Alfred," and "maybe" is written in quotation marks. So here it's a direct reference to what was said before. So I wouldn't have expected that.
Yeah, it's a quote within a quote. So to speak, even though the speech bubble serves as kind of visual quotation marks. If the character is quoting someone else, then quotation marks are used. But the quotation marks can also be used in comic book dialogue, kind of in the way we might use air quotes when talking to each other in real life.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that would be the case for the maybe example, but also for another one that I found where someone said, "Funny, I didn't think you even knew the word honest." And then honest is written in quotation marks. So here too, I mean, you're talking about the word honest, and people might put air quotes around that in real life.
And use a different intonation, like you did.
Yeah. Exactly. And another very interesting use of quotation marks in the comics that I didn't expect either was in Superman, because sometimes you had narrative boxes, and in those narrative boxes you had the direct speech or thought of a character who was not shown in the image. And you knew who was talking because, I mean, you knew it from the previous context. But so in that case, this was just to show, okay, that's a speech of someone who's not being shown. So that was also quite unexpected. It's a kind of use that I was unaware of myself. And so that's why it's so important not to just do quantitative research and count how often the punctuation marks occur, but to also look at them from a qualitative perspective, to look at where, in what context they occur and what functions they fulfill.
Right. Yeah, I actually think it's really intuitive, because you can imagine, like in a film, you can imagine hearing a character's voice who is not currently on screen, which would be for a stylistic purpose. You would do that for a stylistic purpose. That happens in movies all the time. So that's how it's sort of replicated in written form in a comic book. That is really cool, actually.
Yeah, totally. So I thought it was very interesting to look at these very, very special uses, because I learned so much about them myself. But then, of course, other uses, surprised me because I hadn't even thought about them. I mean, the full stops, for example, in the academic articles. Quite a lot of the full stops in the academic articles were abbreviations. So when you have references to literature that you use, sometimes several authors write a text together, and then you might say, okay, this text was written by, let's say,
Sanchez, Stockhammer, et al.
Yeah, for example, et al. Exactly. And then et al. Is an abbreviation with a full stop. It comes from Latin et alii, which means and others. But so this full stop really raised the number of full stops. It raised the count for the academic texts.
For like shortenings. Yeah, absolutely. Similar with et cetera, etc. dot. Yeah.
And I mean, if you looked at the commas, for example, in the comics, quite a lot of the commas were after the name of a person that was being addressed, like Toyman, comma, you maniac, or man, comma, would you look at that? Yeah, so in this kind of vocative function, we just kind of appeal to someone, and that's a use of commas that you wouldn't find at all in academic texts.
Yeah, Christina, comma, how are you? You wouldn't. Yeah, that's more like spoken word or written dialogue. Yeah. Yeah, it's really cool what you were able to find despite the pretty small scale of this study. I found the results really compelling. Yeah,
me too. And I mean, as I said, and as I already talked more about that in the previous episode. I mean, it's a lot of work to compile a corpus with texts from comics, and that's why that one was so short, and that's why I wanted to match it more or less in length with the academic articles. But I think it would be very, very interesting to do a large-scale study of this, because I think that the reward would be that in the end you could show, well, there are significant differences, and punctuation marks are really also highly register specific. And I think this is a gold mine that hasn't been explored enough yet.
Oh yeah, well, the mark of a good study is replicability, right? Can it be replicated by other researchers? I think this study would be relatively straightforward to replicate and even expand.
Yeah, definitely. And I would be very happy to do so.
Excellent. Well, a good study always ends with further lines of inquiry for future researchers, and I think we've done a good job of ending this episode with some lines of inquiry. So with that, Christina, I think it's time to dash, as it were.
Yes, let's put a bracket around this episode.
Excellent. Excellent.
So, stay curious, have fun with language.
And join us next time on Linguistics Behind the Scenes.